For many, taking the bus is an everyday occurrence. Whether you use it to get to work or school, it is a great way to get around. It is important to always show gratitude towards the drivers who are more than willing to get us from A to B. Before we continue, please take some time to subscribe to Dailydose, like and share this video with your friends. While generally, aside from a bit of noise and dirt, things tend to be smooth sailing, occasionally something unexpected happens. Margaret had been a bus driver for 10 years, but nothing could have prepared her for the way things would turn out on this particular morning. Working on the bus line for 10 years has meant that Margaret has seen all sorts, from drunkards to street performers, and everything in between. She has, unfortunately, been forced to kick passengers off the bus on multiple occasions. This particular morning was like nothing she had ever experienced. She had never had a passenger quite like this before. It was a morning like any other. She was driving through town, doing her usual rounds when she noticed something bizarre. A little boy was standing alone at the bus stop, seemingly waiting for her to arrive. She pulled up at the bus stop, as was her custom. As she got closer, she could see the little boy more clearly. He was young and looked very frightened. He was clinging to the pole, and when she approached, he said nothing. It was clear that something wasn't right. She turned to face him and asked him an important question. It was clear that the poor young boy had been crying. She had to approach this situation with sensitivity. She spoke softly and asked him where he was headed. This was a question that she always asked children to ensure that they were on the correct bus. His response shocked her. Upon taking a closer look, Margaret noticed something odd about this little boy. He wasn't wearing any shoes. While it was a summer's morning, it was still a chilly one, and no one in their right mind should have been without shoes. As Margaret anxiously anticipated an explanation from the boy, she noticed a remarkable detail. The boy initially seemed reluctant to tell his story. Why was this? Was he worried that his story might get him into trouble? Margaret made sure that the little boy felt comfortable enough to explain his situation to her. After a short pause, he sighed and began to talk. He explained to her that earlier that morning, he had been playing in his front yard when he had spotted a rabbit. He had decided to follow it and ended up chasing it through the woods. The rabbit eventually managed to shake him off. He had been so caught up in the chase that he hadn't realized where he was. He was lost. He came to the conclusion that there was nothing that he could do except walk and hope for the best. He was very confused and afraid. It was at this point that he noticed the bus stop. He assumed that at some point, a bus would show up and he would be able to get on it and find his way back home. The bus had taken a long time to come, and whilst he was waiting, he had become more and more stressed and upset. When Margaret finally turned up, he was relieved. He might be able to get back home after all. Margaret was relieved when she heard his story. She had been concerned that perhaps he had been abandoned. When he explained that he was lost, everything made sense, including the fact that he wasn't wearing any shoes. However, she was still a little worried. While she was glad that the little boy had not been kidnapped or abandoned, some parent out there would be desperately searching for him. However, Margaret was aware that she was still on the clock and needed to finish her route. She carefully weighed up what the best thing to do would be. She knew what she had to do. She alerted her boss of what had happened via the radio, and together, they came to the conclusion that she should cancel the rest of her route for that morning. After the call, she made an announcement to the passengers on the bus, informing them about what had happened. While this was inconvenient, they all agreed that the most important thing was to get the little boy home. Margaret dropped the rest of the passengers off at the nearest bus stop and focused her attention on the young boy. She needed to locate his family. She asked him his name, and he told her, but he wasn't able to give her his home address. He tried to describe his house with difficulty. He didn't have much of an idea concerning the whereabouts of his home. All he knew was his first and last name and his age. At this point, they were all the way out in the woods. Finding his home would be a difficult task on her own. What could she do? Margaret's thoughts turned to social media. Perhaps if she posted a picture of the boy online, it might gain enough traction for it to reach someone who knows him. However, she wasn't sure that this was appropriate. Perhaps the photo would end up attracting the wrong kind of people, or the parents might not be too happy about having their son's face plastered all over the internet. She couldn't do this without consent. She needed to think of a different method. As Margaret mulled over the various options in her mind, she heard the little boy's stomach rumble behind her. When she looked at the time, she realized that all of this must have happened before he had eaten his breakfast. He must have been starving. She decided it was best to deal with this problem first. Margaret drove the little boy to the nearest fast food restaurant and ordered the kid's meal, ensuring that she checked that there were no common allergens before ordering. The boy wolfed the food down before the pair of them walked back to the bus. Margaret decided that this was a task that she couldn't do on her own. She needed to inform the police. Together, the pair headed to the police station. The little boy was nervous about going to the police station and was still very distressed about his situation. All he wanted was to be back with his parents. Margaret had to reassure him that he wasn't in any kind of trouble with the police. She explained that they needed the help of the police in order for him to be reunited with his parents. This was enough for him to feel comforted. They pulled up at the police station on the bus and hopped out. Margaret took the little boy's hand and they walked into the station. They sat in the waiting room as the officers dealt with other people. Finally, the time came for them to speak to the police. Both Margaret and the little boy explained their stories to the officer in question. Afterwards, he smiled and offered the young boy a piece of candy. While the boy was distracted, he turned to Margaret, thanked her, and then explained that getting the boy back to his parents would be a long process. First of all, Margaret would need to give her testimony to her supervisor, who wouldn't be free for another hour. Then it would be up to the supervisor to decide on what course of action would be best in terms of getting the boy back to his parents. Margaret wasn't at all happy with this. She had agreed with her boss that she would make up for missing the morning route by doing the afternoon shift. She was concerned that if she canceled her second shift, she might end up with a formal reprimand. She knew that the only other option was to leave the young boy at the station. However, she decided that she couldn't do that to the young boy. She would have to just wait and hope that the supervisor would be free sooner so that she could make it to her shift on time. Unfortunately, this isn't what happened. The supervisor still hadn't turned up an hour later. After waiting a further 15 minutes, the officer informed Margaret that the supervisor was on her way back to the station now and sent her sincerest apologies. In the meantime, the young boy was fast asleep on Margaret's lap. The supervisor finally showed up. She thanked Margaret for waiting and told the officers exactly what they needed to do. They would pass on the young boy's age and physical description to all of the stations in the vicinity, and then, if anyone had reported a missing child, they could check whether the descriptions matched. Not long after sending out the information, Margaret was told that the boy's parents had likely been found. They were on the way to the station now to collect their son. Margaret breathed a sigh of relief. She had done what she had set out to do. Everything had worked out well in the end. Margaret was confident that she would be able to make it in for her afternoon shift, and the young boy would be reunited with his parents. As the boy slept, cuddled up closely to her, she brushed his hair as neatly as she could. The last thing I wanted was his parents getting more panicked over his state. The parents turned up promptly, looking very worried. It transpired that they had been searching for their little boy all morning and had immediately reported his disappearance to the police, concerned that he might have been kidnapped. When the couple saw their boy sitting there, they were absolutely ecstatic. They couldn't have been happier to have their son back in their arms. He and Margaret explained the whole story once again. Everyone agreed that the little boy had been amazing and very brave. Then they turned their attention to Margaret. The parents were beyond grateful for everything that she had done, and both the parents and the police offered to verify the story to her boss. Margaret smiled and told them it wasn't necessary. She was glad that the young boy was safely back with his family. However, an unexpected complication arose that threatened to ruin everything for Margaret. As Margaret and the parents headed towards the door out of the station, they were halted by the police officer. They couldn't understand why. The police explained that while the young boy was safe now, they had no choice but to call in child protection services. Each individual that had been involved in the incident was required to submit a testimonial for the social worker who was sent to deal with the case. Margaret felt sad for the parents, but she was also worried about the timing of it all. It was now looking unlikely that she would make her afternoon shift. Half an hour later, the social worker arrived at the station. After having a quick chat with everyone, she invited them all in for individual interviews. She then concluded that the parents were free to take their son home, but she would have to do a few routine visits before being totally satisfied that everything was as it should be. Everything had worked out well, but Margaret still had one problem. She ended up having to cancel her route for a second time and was concerned that she might get in trouble for it. On the contrary, however, she was hailed a hero. The police backed up her story to her boss. In order to express their gratitude, the boy's parents bought her an enormous bouquet of flowers. After some time, the little boy was able to go home with his parents. Before leaving, he gave Margaret a big cuddle as a way of saying thank you. Everyone was extremely grateful at the way things had turned out. Margaret even exchanged numbers with the parents so that they could stay in contact. Several weeks later, the story went viral. Margaret received a huge amount of praise and even ended up being given a pay increase. Margaret and the young boy have formed a lovely relationship and often go out for fast food together. This is an incredible story of the importance of helping out those in need. Things could have ended up a lot worse for Spencer if Margaret hadn't selflessly intervened.